Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Policy Exchange. My name's Guy Newey. I'm Head of Environment and Energy at Policy Exchange. For those of you who are new to Policy Exchange, and it's nice to see lots of new faces in the audience today, we worry about two main things in the... We worry about microphones, first of all. We worry about two main things in the environment and energy space. One, how you can achieve environmental goals as cost effectively as possible. We've done a lot of work in climate change area and energy on that issue, but also things like improving biodiversity. But secondly, we also see it as our role to highlight environmental problems that perhaps are not getting enough attention in the policy debate. This is part of the reason that we produced our report last year, Something in the Air. I think there are copies at the back, at least there were copies at the back. I suspect they may have gone already. And it's that, as well as producing that report, it's kind of the reason that we held today's debate. Air quality is a huge public health concern, which I'm sure our excellent panel will talk about in more details. Just some brief figures. So each year, around 29,000 deaths are attributable to man-made fine particulate air pollution in the UK. And poor air quality is thought to cost the economy in the region of £15 billion a year. Our research found that in many ways it hits the poorest hardest. In London's worst 10% of areas for NO2 pollution, primary school kids who lived in that area are 47% more likely than the average to be on free school meals. 320,000 children attend schools within 150 metres of roads carrying more than 10,000 vehicles a day. That's the kind of level of traffic that's been found to increase risk of developing or exacerbating asthma in young people. Of course, certainly not just a London problem, a problem in many cities across the UK. It's important to stress, and I'm sure we'll get into this in the debate, that it's a difficult problem to deal with. Both administratively, it falls across lots of departments, health, transport, DEFRA, and crucially between national, local, and indeed European authorities. Lots of different sources of pollution. Many of those are very valuable to our economy and also much loved. It's worth pointing out. And of course the effects are diffuse in many ways as well. And a tricky one for people who are concerned about environmental problems is it often clashes with other environmental goals, and this particularly plays out in the debate about how we deal with diesel vehicles. So today we're going to be looking at one of the dominant issues that we have to face when you're talking about air quality, and that's what can we do about pollution from road transport. Some of the key questions we want to look at today are what are the policy options? We've discussed some of them, but they're certainly not exhaustive. The role of standards for vehicles. What opportunities are there for policy innovations, both in terms of new technologies, but also perhaps a greater understanding of behaviours, nudges, as well as old-fashioned price signals and command and control regulation. We'll probably get into the debate about how should the government approach the negotiation of future European targets for air quality, as well as that issue of how you balance different and competing, sometimes, environmental goals. Now, today, we're delighted to welcome an outstanding panel to discuss these issues. In the order that they will speak, Norman Baker has been the MP for Lewes since 1997. He's held lots of front bench roles in transport and environmental fields, and in this context he was appointed a Minister for Transport when the coalition was formed, and he has a long list of responsibilities including rail, buses, taxis, etc., but crucially cleaner fuel vehicles and sustainable travel. One thing I didn't know about Norman before I knew today, he's a pioneer in Lib Dem circles. A lot of attention paid on Nick Clegg and his weekly radio show on LBC. Norman's been doing this for a lot longer on Sea Haven FM, which, how long have you been doing that, Norman?
4 years.
Yes, well, anyway, I highly recommend, I had a brief listen, but a mixture of some pretty obscure records, it's fair to say, on kind of jazz, blues, swing, cooking. So it's obviously, a country is obviously an area of great interest for him, as well as the one we'll be talking about today. Our second speaker is Matthew Penchars, who's the Environment and Political Advisor to the Mayor of London. He's held the environment role since the Mayor's re-election. Sad to say that, like me, he has a dark past as a journalist. Matthew worked for the BBC in their political team, but he's also worked for Barnet Council on some of their, crucially on some of their recycling work. He's a very keen cyclist, and particularly delighted about the air conditioning in this room, as I suspect all of us are today. And if it does become unbearably hot still with 100 or 90 of you in the room, please stick up your hand before you pass out. Alan Andrews is an environmental lawyer at the NGO Client Earth, which is doing some of the most interesting work in this area, harnessing the power of the law to deal with environmental issues. Alan's probably best known for his work on air quality and the case he's brought against the UK government for failing to meet air quality standards, and I think there's some news on that this morning, which no doubt he'll tell you about soon. He's soon off to Brussels to work more closely on air quality issue. He said beforehand that he's going to Brussels for as long as it takes to solve the problem, which I thought was wonderfully optimistic, or he really likes chips and beer. And last but by no means least, we have Barry Gardiner, who's been MP for Brent North since 1997, and recently parachuted into a new role as Shadow Minister for DEFRA. Slightly as an aside, but I'd like to take this opportunity to praise Barry for his work on the Energy and Climate Change Select Committee, where he has shown a real expertise and, to the worry of all witnesses who have appeared there, a forensic questioning style. I'm sure he'll bring the same energies to his new role and hopefully to today's debate. So each speaker will speak for around 7 or 8 minutes. We'll have plenty of time for questions, and we'll aim to wrap up just after 2:30. So I'll start with asking.
Thanks, Guy. Thanks for asking me along today, and thanks also for the plug for my radio show. Very, very kind of you. Music is an important part of my life. I won't mention my CD. That'd be entirely inappropriate in this particular venue, but it is available from all good record shops and from Amazon. Something in the Air was your report, which for me was a #1 hit by Thunderclap Newman, but never mind that. It's good nevertheless.
You were aware of that?
I was aware of that. Okay, good. Well, it's also #1 hit in some regards. Anyway, on to serious matters. And this is a serious matter. The quality of our air is important. And the government's taking 3 broad strands to try to improve matters. First of all, we're seeking to decarbonise road transport. Secondly, we're seeking to secure modal shift away from cars where that's possible. And thirdly, we're tackling air quality in its own right through various measures. So let me deal with some of those. In terms of decarbonisation, we do believe that it's important both for air quality and indeed for our own industry, as a matter of fact, to be investing heavily in low-carbon vehicles and making sure we're in pole position in Europe when it comes to that particular direction of travel. I hope you'll have noticed as part of the announcement from the Secretary of State yesterday that we've allocated yet another £500 million up to 2020 to support the growing market for ultra-low emission vehicles. That's to add to the £400 million already allocated in this particular 4-year period, both to promote the uptake of ultra-low emission vehicles through discounts for new cars and vans. Secondly, through the rollout of charge points, and we're now seeing these appearing pretty much across the country, both from the public support, but also increasingly from private companies. And thirdly, through R&D support as well. And the consequence of that is not simply to have put us to a good position in Europe, but also to have encouraged investment in this country so that we can hopefully become a centre for low-carbon vehicle production as well as the years go on. We want to become the dominant market for that, in fact. And that package, I think, is a good way of achieving that. So we've been pushing along in different directions. We've also had a further £37 million earlier this year, which the Department for Transport announced for more recharging infrastructure. That, for example, will give grants towards the installation of charge points at railway stations. We're encouraging train companies to take up that particular suggestion. People can park there, obviously, when they go in the morning to get to work and then come back and the car is charged. Also, obviously, support for local authorities as well in their installation of charge points as well. And also working with those involved in fleet business to encourage them to take up low carbon vehicles. So I think that's going quite well. Secondly, and I'm conscious that we've got 8 minutes or thereabouts, is a question of modal shift. Matthew may well talk about this from the London perspective, but I think I have to say, and I hope everybody would recognise, London has been a great success in terms of modal shift. Car and motorcycle congestion during weekday morning peak hours is down 40% compared to where it was in 2001. The number of cyclists has almost tripled, and that's a great achievement, I think, for successive mayors in London. And we want to try to emulate that in other cities across Britain. The Local Sustainable Transport Fund, which I introduced in 2010, has, I think, been well received. That has unlocked over £600 million of government money, but also match funding has taken it to over £1 billion. And that's all been spent on schemes which have to demonstrate a reduction in carbon and a means to promote growth in the economy as well. Those two things being two sides of the same coin, of course. And the way many of those schemes have done that has been to secure modal shift. 94 of the 96 schemes, for example, have promoted cycling in some shape or form. So modal shift is certainly possible within that tight urban conurbation. It's also possible at a longer distance travel, and it's one of the reasons why we've got the biggest rail investment programme since the 19th century presently underway. For example, we're electrifying, I think a loose track, we keep adding to the figure, but about 880 miles of track. 1 in 9 miles of railway track is being electrified under this government, and if Barry will forgive me, that compares with 9 miles under the previous 13 years of the Labour government. So there's a huge step change in investment in rail taking place, which is encouraging people to move onto rail, which is obviously helping air quality, particularly as we get rid of diesel trains and replace them with electric trains. And that has meant, over the last few years, we've seen inexorable rises in rail passenger numbers, while road traffic has been reasonably flat. In fact, we've now got more people on the railway than any time since 1927 on a network about half the size. Thirdly, we're looking, of course, to tackle air quality in its own right, where that has to be tackled. And where there's an economic case, we're happy to fund measures. In London, the GLA and TfL are running a scheme match funded by the department to reduce nitrogen oxide emissions from older buses operating in major pollution hotspots by retrofitting selective catalytic reduction equipment in 900 buses. In 2011, we also funded a £5 million programme of measures to reduce particulate matter from the capital. And with the lessons learned from London, we're currently preparing a pilot with another £5 million specifically on reducing NOx emissions from older buses operating in other cities and towns across the country. And local authorities can bid for contributions towards that fund, and the bidding process in fact closes this Friday. A further example of the shared benefits that come from investment in this area is the low-carbon truck trial that we've invested £11 million on, which is designed to deal with air quality problems that arise from HGVs. And it includes, of course, the help towards the rollout of a network of natural gas refilling stations. And that is designed particularly to deal with the EU Ambient Air Directive and to try to make sure we're compliant with that. We've also had 4 rounds now of the Green Bus Fund. That's released £87 million of money, which has been topped up, of course, by either local authorities or by bus operators to replace older polluting buses with new state-of-the-art buses, whether they're hybrid buses or whether they're electric buses or gas buses. And we're seeing considerable investment, which is not only helping to deal with air pollution, but actually making buses more attractive for passengers and therefore helping the modal shift argument as well. That's enabled around 1,200 new low-emission buses to be brought into service. And, of course, it's also helped stimulate the industry itself for the production of more buses bought commercially, and many of which, of course, are manufactured in this country. But I don't want to pretend that we are without problems, or there isn't a challenge, because there certainly is. As with many other member states, 23 out of 27 member states are failing EU air quality standards. The great majority of the UK complies, but hotspots do exist near particular roads and in urban centres. We've also not got to be complacent. Of course, we're in a better position than some other countries, and if anyone's been to Beijing, that is a far worse problem than we have in this country. And there are other many other towns and cities across the world where that applies as well. Yes, we've made progress over the years under successive governments. We've eliminated lead from vehicle tailpipes. There's big reductions in other air pollutants, and looking at the graphs of how pollutants were 20, 30 years ago compared to how they are now is a very heartwarming experience. There's been huge progress in reducing emissions over that period of time, and that includes emissions of NOx and particulate matter. But there's clearly more to be done, but we have to make sure, of course, that we don't do it at the expense of tackling climate change. And that's the point perhaps I want to leave you with in a moment, which is there is sometimes a tension between acting to deal with climate change and acting to deal with air quality. And that's one of the balancing acts which a government has to take and the Department for Transport has to take. On a very simple level, there's a limited amount of money, a finite amount of money, and that can either go directly towards tackling climate change or it can go towards tackling air quality. They're not the same thing, of course. And sometimes, actually, by fitting or retrofitting buses, you can actually make the carbon consequences marginally worse. So we do have to balance these things in taking our decisions. But of course, if we can decarbonise road transport entirely, and that's something I would like to do, it may be more difficult with lorries and buses, but certainly with cars it's perfectly possible to do that, and we should be able to do it by about 2040. Then of course that, in a sense, solves the air pollution problem in terms of vehicle emissions anyway. So I can confirm that we are working cross-departmentally with our colleagues in DEFRA and other government departments. I can confirm we're taking this whole issue seriously across government, and I look forward to engaging in a Q&A. Thank you again for asking me along this afternoon.
Well, thank you, Policy Exchange, for hosting this important event. Addressing London's air quality is a priority for the Mayor, and London is leading innovation in how to address this problem. But we know it's a real challenge. But it's a challenge we have to meet. There is the obvious human health impact, which Guy alluded to at the beginning. There is the cost of business, and also the reputational impact on London and the UK if we don't improve our air quality and be seen to be improving it. Our air is a part of our city's quality of life, and quality of life is one of the reasons why people choose to live here and companies to invest here. And if we can improve air quality, we improve our international offer and move our ratings up the international scales, then the likelihood of attracting international investment increases. However, the failure of the Euro engine standards to deliver the emission savings we'd expected and the rapid dieselisation of our car fleet has not made meeting this challenge any easier. It is in fact much tougher than we had thought just a few years ago. And that's why the Mayor has done a huge amount, at no small expense from both the public and private sectors, to address it. So in his first term, I'll just canter through these, he was the first one to bring in taxi age limits to get the oldest and most polluting black cabs and private hire vehicles off the streets. We have the cleanest and greenest large bus fleet in the world. That's 1,700 hybrids by 2016. He's tightened the low emission zone, which is the largest of its type in the world. And also the planning system for new development. We're using the planning system for new developments to ensure that what replaces them is better than what went before. And this has led to reduction since the current Mayor was elected of PM10 emissions by 15% and NOx emissions by 20%. And we are just complying with PM10, but we are a long way from complying with nitrogen dioxide, as are most major European cities and indeed much smaller town cities across the UK. So this is not just a London problem. But the Mayor intends to build on these achievements in his second term. So by 2015, all our buses will meet Euro 4 standards, retiring the more polluting Euro 3s, replacing them with 900 Euro 6s. And that comes at a cost of £18 million of tax and fair pays money. And also the buildings retrofit. Now, I know this is mainly a road transport event, but it's worth mentioning that buildings and their boilers do contribute quite a lot of emissions. So we'll be really ramping up our buildings retrofit programs, 400 public buildings with 200 schools in the pipeline. And we recently changed the green vehicle discount, we call an ultra low emission discount, and this was to address the fact that many smaller polluting diesels were getting in underneath the carbon limit. And that came into at the beginning of this month, and I'm pleased to see adverts for cars like the Renault Zoe, I'll give them a plug, actually advertising that they are congestion charge exempt, which is exactly what we wanted to do, was to stimulate that market. And then there's the Mayor's Air Quality Fund, which is, along with the boroughs, finding innovative solutions for localised air quality problems. Turning to the future, the demographic pressure on London is quite astonishing. Since the current mayor is elected, another 600,000 people are Londoners. By 2021, there'll be another million. By 2030, we'll be up to 10 million. This is the largest growth that London has ever seen in its history. It's faster than that growth in the interwar period when Metroland was built as the tubes were thrown out to the outer suburbs. So the Mayor published last month his 2020 vision, which is a high-level vision on what we think should be in train and what should be completed by 2020 to meet this demographic challenge and to grab the opportunities that it presents. So you would have heard, I think last week, the Roads Task Force, which put forward an exciting programme to address some of the issues with our roads. Some of that was tunnellisation and the improvement of junctions. And the ultra-low emission zone, which the Mayor announced his intention of in February this year, is part of that. And he's hoping to build a consensus around this. So we're going ahead now, consulting with stakeholders, industry, the boroughs, the car manufacturers, to try and build that consensus and do the feasibility study to give the Mayor final proposals by the end of the year. We really don't want, by building a consensus across the political parties, if we can, across all those stakeholders, we hope that it doesn't get caught up in the next mayoral election in 2016, and there is some sort of certainty for industry and for people and for boroughs of what's coming in 2020. And then we're going to go through the legal steps and the consultation and scheme order in 2014. And that gives 6 years for everyone to get ready for the ultra-low emission zone. And there obviously are lots of options on all this. I'm sure we'll be asking questions about me later. But we are now going to industry to see what is a reasonable ask for boroughs and residents and industry to meet that limit. But it is worth saying that in discussions with the Mayor, it's quite on the ULEZ and how tight it should be. He really wants a step change. He doesn't want a moderately accelerated business as usual situation. He really does want a step change. He is frustrated, as I think everybody else is, at the slow lack of take-up of electric vehicles. And he sees these regulatory measures could actually really push the boundaries of that. And where London leads, we hope the rest of the country will follow. I'd like to quickly take this opportunity to address some of the more far-fetched rumours that have been buzzing around the Twitter sphere. And that is the Mayor, and we are not lobbying the European Union to weaken air quality laws. Anyone who says that the Mayor and the GLA is doing so is either ignorant of what we're actually up to or is frankly lying. Our lobbying of the EU for our lobbying of the EU is actually getting some real traction. We've asked for engine standards that actually work in the ways that Euros 4 and 5 haven't. And we believe that Euro 6 should work, and they've transferred the risk onto the car manufacturers this time, which should actually focus them a bit better than perhaps it has previously. And the latest consultation document from the Commission talks about an urban clean air fund, which we've been pushing for a while. And we are a transparent administration. All the relevant documents are online, and our response to EU consultation has now been placed there. Then there makes a big thing about the transparency of data. We have the London Data Store, which puts all this data on in a spreadsheetable format so that clever people can go and build apps and the like. And we provide that data and support organisations to air text to ensure that the information is out there and the most vulnerable Londoners are aware when there are air quality episodes. And it's worth, it's maybe a rarity, but praising the Green Party for using some of the data that was released to make their own roads that are the most polluted. I would like to say that the GLA is coming up with another one where we like to believe that the data will be a bit more transposed in perhaps a more accurate way, but that's exactly what that data is there for organisations, the Green Party or AirTex or other people, to take that and build instruments that can help people. Finally, I'd like to say that air quality is a shared problem. All levels of government, that's the boroughs, the GLA, central government and the EU have a part to play. So I will end on some very gentle lobbying of central government, after thanking them, of course, for all the support that Norman just ran through from the DFT. As the UK's and Europe's biggest city, our problem with air quality is one of the most challenging to address, and we have the most amount of human exposure to it. By 2015, DEFRA's own analysis suggests that more than half of the UK roads exceeding nitrogen dioxide limits will be in London. And with our population density, that is far more than 50% of the population in the UK being affected by poor air quality is in the capital. We've shown our ability through Transport for London to deliver at scale and at getting bang for the taxpayer's buck. We understand, of course, that budgets are tight, but they should be spent where they get the best value, and that is certainly in London. Thank you.
That's great. I'm sure identify any of those issues?
Hi everyone. Thanks, Guy. I should clarify, when I said I was moving to Brussels until the problem's solved, I didn't mean until air pollution was solved. That would be 2050, according to the EU's latest projections, which would be a lot of beer and a lot of waffles. I'm gonna stay out there until the National Emission Ceiling Directive has been adopted. So hopefully that's more like 2 or 3 years. You probably won't be surprised to hear I'm going to start by focusing on the legal aspect of this debate. It's important to put all these issues in their correct legal context. The starting point for me is that we have a right to breathe clean air. What I mean by that, I mean we have the right to breathe air that doesn't make us cough and wheeze, air that doesn't send us to hospital with asthma attacks, air that doesn't kill us with heart attacks and strokes. Above all, air that meets legally binding limits. Now that's all well and good, but rights are pretty meaningless unless they're backed up by duties. In the case of air quality, it's the government that has a legal duty to protect us from air pollution. It's got a duty to monitor and assess air quality. It's got a duty to us to inform us when air quality is a risk to our health. Above all, it has a legal duty to ensure that legal limits are complied with. Where air quality fails to meet those limits, it has to come up with a plan, consult us on that plan, and that plan must show how it's going to achieve limits in the shortest time possible. Remember those words, I'll come back to them. Unfortunately, our government is failing in pretty much every respect to carry out those duties. We know it's failing to meet nitrogen dioxide limits in 41 of 43 zones in the UK, but it's also failing to provide us with adequate information. That's important because we need that information to make the right decisions, not only about how we contribute to air pollution, but how we can protect ourselves and our families from the harmful effects. Most worrying for me is what's happening at the EU level. The UK government, and I'm not talking about the GLA here, I'm talking about DEFRA, have publicly stated that they wanted to use the EU's Year of Air to, they put it in very confusing language, but the short of it was they wanted more flexibility, they wanted, instead of fixed binding limits, they wanted vague targets. The effect of this is threatens to seriously undermine the legal protections we have in EU law. And that's an impact that will be felt not just in the UK, but in 28 member states, and for many years into the future. So, despite having this legal and I'd argue moral duty to protect us from air pollution, what we don't have is a coherent plan from the government on how it's going to actually tackle this public health crisis. The last national air quality strategy was produced in 2007. That's now rather old, and even when it was produced, was pretty inadequate. The only plans we've got really are the government's plans to tackle nitrogen dioxide pollution, which it submitted to the European Commission in support of a time extension application. And really what you see there is not a plan at all in any way. I'd recognise the term. It's merely a description of the business as usual scenario. It's a list of excuses, some of them genuine, some not so, half measures, and basically no coherent plan to tackle this problem. The only new policy specifically aimed at tackling nitrogen dioxide pollution was a very weak commitment to investigate the feasibility of a national system of low emission zones. We've seen no meaningful progress on that proposal since. I think the real plan was to do as little as possible on nitrogen dioxide and hope that they could successfully lobby the EU to weaken the current standards or provide more time, more extensions in which to meet them. That plan has failed in light of overwhelming scientific evidence that shows we actually underestimated the health effects of air pollution. The World Health Organization have now recommended very clearly that the current EU limits need to be significantly tightened. So we're not going to see a weakening of the current NO2 limits or any of the others. We're not going to see more time extensions. So, as Guy mentioned, I've spent the last 3 years fighting for this right to clean air in the UK courts. We had our first breakthrough in May this year when the Supreme Court declared the UK was in breach of EU law. The news story hot off the press was that last night we received notification that the case has now been referred to the European Court. The interesting part is that the Supreme Court has asked that the case be fast-tracked. So it's saying that because there are ongoing breaches of the limits, because we have this 2015 deadline looming, that's the very maximum extendable deadline under the directive. In light of this, the Supreme Court wants the case heard sooner rather than later, so it can give its final order in 2014. In the meantime, the European Commission is poised to take action. If it takes the UK court, the result could be multi-million-pound fines further on down the line. So sooner or later, the government is going to be forced to act, whether it's the European Court or, I think more likely, the UK Supreme Court. But rather than wait and sit on its hands and wait for that order to come, it needs to come forward, get on the front foot, come forward with a coherent plan showing how we're going to tackle pollution, principally from road transport, principally from diesel. I think I was interested to hear Norman Baker's comments. Yes, there's loads of great stuff happening in transport. It's all focused on carbon. These are climate policies. And I think the reason we're in the mess we're in now is this myopic focus on carbon. Yes, diesel performs better in terms of CO2, but it's a disaster from a public health point of view. We've sleepwalked into a situation where now we have more diesel cars being sold than petrol cars. I think even if you start looking at the climate arguments around diesel, they're pretty flaky. Yes, there's a carbon penalty when it comes to diesel, but if you look at the emissions of black carbon and the impacts they have on Arctic warming and global climate, I think the climate case itself starts to look a bit shaky, leaving aside the disaster that it is in terms of public health. How do we do that? Well, I think, for me, a national system of low emission zones is the way to go. At the moment, we have a London low emission zone. It's great. I'm very excited to hear about the ultra low emission zone. Let's hope it happens, and let's hope it happens a lot sooner than sometime after 2020. But as everyone said, this is a national problem. We need low emission zones, not just in London, but in Manchester, Cardiff, Leeds, Birmingham, all the towns and cities where air quality does not meet WHO guidelines. But this process needs to be driven by central government. At the moment, what we're seeing is the national government is doling out little pots of money to local authorities to go off and do their own feasibility studies around low emission zones. That's just not going to work. To me, it's almost a deliberate attempt to kick this issue into the long grass. We need action from central government. We need a coherent system of national low emission zones, so we have the same standard applying in all towns and cities. So if you're a national fleet operator, you know what standard applies wherever your vehicles are driving. That standard has to be at least Euro 6, because we know that Euro 4 and Euro 5 have failed to deliver. And just finally, a word on awareness raising. Yes, it's going to take us a long time to get our air quality to where we need it to be. So in the meantime, it's imperative we focus on raising awareness, give people the information they need to protect themselves and their families. And that's why I get so annoyed when I see what I think is sheer dishonesty around the communication of the public health risk. Time and time again, and Norman did it just then, we see it every time there's an air quality news story. DEFRA trot out the same rubbish. Air quality meets EU standards in most of the UK. That is just so misleading. Most of us don't live in the UK. We live in towns and cities where pollution is 2-3 times legal limits. The starting point has to be an honest conversation about the public health risks and how we're going to solve them. Thanks.
Thanks very much. Norman, I'll give you a chance to come back on some of those points. Barry.
Guy, thank you very much. And can I say congratulations for this report? I know it's a year since you actually published it, but congratulations nonetheless. And I don't say that just because you quoted me in it. When I referred to Boris's attempts to put the sweepers down the streets where there were monitoring vehicles as putting oxygen masks on the canaries in the mines. But I was very pleased by the recommendation that you put in place there, that localized sanitization around a reporting station should be thoroughly investigated. It was a very good recommendation. Can I start off, though, by declaring my interest? And I've put my glasses on not because I need them to see you, but because I wanted to admit to being one of the myopic of our generation. I was fooled. I did exactly that. I went out and I bought my Kia Rio. I bought my Kia Rio because it was going to be under 98 grams, I think, per kilometre. And I thought myself extraordinarily virtuous. And then I realized, actually, I was needing to put my spectacles back on. So really good information there about the way in which we get focused on one problem and don't realize that actually in tackling it, we're creating another one and making it much worse. Can I also inform you that by the time I finish speaking, that's if I do finish speaking in the time limit that Guy set me, there will have been one further death in England, and by the time you all get home this evening, there will have been one further death in London from air pollution. And I make reference to the Clean Air in London app, which I hope all of you have downloaded on your phones so that you can see exactly what is going on in your own area. And it really is, it's fantastic. It tells you that in London, the PM levels against the WHO of 10 are 14.3 currently. In my own borough of Brent, I now have to wait another 2 more days until the next death is likely to happen, because 7.2% of the deaths in my borough are attributable to human-made air pollution. And that's working on the statistics that we've had from the Commission on the Medical Commission investigating the effects of air pollution. They're the ones that are quoted in the policy exchange pamphlet. Look, let me tell you a little anecdote about when I first became a minister in DEFRA. The very first meeting I had was when I was sat down by my officials in 2006, and I was told that we had these wonderful things called biodiversity targets, and 2010 was going to be the year of biodiversity. And I said, great, what's the biodiversity target? And they said, well, the biodiversity target is that we reduce the decline, the species decline, by half by 2010. I said, fantastic. I said, great. So what are we reducing it from? What was the baseline? And they said, well, we didn't actually have a baseline. And the trouble is that the government is now, DEFRA is now, just last week in fact, proposing to yet again junk the need for baseline statistics. Because in the consultation that it put out last week, it's proposed in option 3, which is its preferred option, to remove the requirement on local authorities to 1, carry out detailed assessments of air quality, 2, make or amend air quality management areas, 3, carry out or update screening assessments, and 4, carry out further assessments. So there we have it. The response from the government on how we can do more to improve air quality management is do not measure it. Now, I thought that the sort of the rule in government was that which is measured is managed. What gets measured is managed. It's not, if you don't want the problem of managing it, don't measure it. So how can it be that any sensible politician looks at the problem of air pollution, which all of us acknowledge, and it's difficult to do stuff with. And, you know, I recognise the work that the Mayor's done in the last year, and great, he's taken on board some of the recommendations that were in this report. You know, and I know that, you know, Norman really does care about this sort of stuff. You know, I was saying to him the other day, I think fantastic what he's done on introducing cycling. 40 million you've given into cycling in the national parks and stuff like that. Brilliant stuff. So, I mean, it's not as if these guys don't care about it, but what on earth goes on in the minds of an official in DEFRA to actually say, oh, well, you know what we'll do? We'll just get rid of our capacity to know how big the problem is. It just doesn't make any sense at all. Because if you don't know how big the problem is, if you don't see where things are going wrong, where they're going down or getting better, you know, they actually said in that consultation, I do hope you will all respond to the consultation, by the way. You know, it's only just opened. Of course, it is only a 6-week consultation at the end of the parliamentary session, just as we go into recess before the summer holidays. 6 weeks, not the 12 that government consultations are supposed to be, right? So you've got 6 weeks to respond to the consultation. But in that consultation, what they did was they said, maybe the money that is saved on measuring this problem can be put into tackling this problem. Well, look, I go over Westminster Bridge pretty much every week, right? And you've seen the guys there, haven't you, with the 3-card trick and doing the, you know, seeing what they can do. I mean, this is just nonsense, isn't it? £11.3 million across the whole of the United Kingdom is going to make a substantial difference in tackling the problem, because we don't know whether when we put that £11.3 million into new action to solve the problem all across the United Kingdom, we're not going to be able to tell whether it's done any good or not, because actually we won't be measuring the outcomes. I really sometimes think these guys take us for fools. But actually, what staggers me is that their own ministers in the department look at this shit. Sorry, I'm allowed to use that word because Kay at the back is the best conversation guy I've ever had with anyone in the run-up to the meeting. Right? It was about whale shit. No, it was brilliant. But it's lovely and it's all related. It's all about natural capital. And it's the law of unintended consequences, wasn't it, Kay? And you were telling me about the way in which if you kill whales, you'd think that that would mean that fish stocks go up. But in fact, fish stocks go down because whale shit is what the plankton feed on, and the plankton is the origin of the food chain, so you actually get more fish out of it. It's a great, brilliant story. Loved it. Anyway, but you wonder what it is that these guys in DEFRA, ministerial office, have been eating. Anyway, look, today we've had the reports that we've had an ozone spike yesterday. The ozone spike, of course, is 100. The target is 100. Harlington yesterday was 150. Richmond yesterday was 160. 180, and they would actually have to issue a warning to the public, right? So with today's temperatures, we could get perilously close in London to 180 for ozone. I expect that some of you are going to say, well, okay, you know, what are you going to do about it? If your lot gets back in, what are you going to do about it? Because, okay, good. I'm glad. You see, you're pleased you gave me more than that extra 1 minute, aren't you? So what are we going to do about it? And I'm not trying to say that this is easy, but let me give you some ideas, okay? So we have to be much bolder in pedestrianisation. The 20-mile-an-hour zones in densely populated areas all around the country that Alan was speaking about are vital. Extending those low-emission zones around the country. Requiring local authorities to submit annual progress reports about how they're tackling the problem. Spare the air days like they have in San Francisco, so that people are warned when it's going to be a spike and they actually are encouraged to stay at home and work from home. I think Boris has got, what is he calling it now, breathe easy days or something like that? Hey, you're the guy in charge of it. Don't look down there. They don't know. You're supposed to be telling them. Breathe better. Breathe better together. Okay, I really should wrap up. Look, I'm delighted that the Supreme Court has sent this through to the European Court. I'm delighted that the European Court has said it's going to fast-track it. And I think that if anything is going to put pressure on this government to get it right, it's the thought that at the end of the day, there could be millions and millions and millions of pounds of public money that you and I are going to be furious about, because instead of going into tackling this problem, it's going to be paying the fines that have resulted from their inaction.
I'd like to thank three of our panellists for keeping to time. Before I'm going to open for questions, we're going to have about 25 minutes, but I'm going to just go back, give Norman a chance to respond as the first speaker. Alan said failing in every respect, and he criticised you particularly for that point about most parts of the UK are okay for air quality. Do you want to come back on those?
Well, I think it's, I don't think anyone can fairly say that government is failing in all respects. That's a sort of crude attack which doesn't actually undermines Alan's case. I gave a list, I think, very fairly of the steps we're taking in decarbonising transport. I'll come back to that in a second, on modal shift and on dealing with air quality. Now, Alan may think we should do more or do something different, but we're not failing in all respects. That's clearly not a fair accusation to make. But can I come back to the point which he raised about diesel and about decarbonisation, because that's the point you made there. First of all, we're not promoting diesel, just to be absolutely clear about that. We're not promoting diesel. What we're promoting are low carbon vehicles, whether they're fuel cell vehicles or electric vehicles or whatever they happen to be, because that's the future. It so happens that we have to in diesel sales. That's not something we've encouraged or the previous government encouraged. It's just happened, and it's a problem which has resulted as a consequence. But if we, if we decarbonise the road transport network, and you're right that we are concentrating on carbon, that solves the air quality problem. If all the vehicles are decarbonised, there isn't an air quality issue. So they are not opposites in that sense. Second point I wanted to make was that you could say that we've got a problem in terms of compliance, but I think it's also fair to point out so do 23 out of 27 EU states. This is not easy. Nobody, no government, no minister, no department wants people to have air which is less than good. Nobody wants that. And why would we want that? We're breathing it ourselves. We've got families. Why do we anyone want that? The fact is, it's quite difficult to comply with that directive, as all other member states, apart from like Ireland and Croatia or someone is finding out. Not least of all for the reason that Matthew gave about the underperformance of the new standards compared to what we all thought they were going to produce. And lastly, in terms of, just pick up Barry's point at the end there, we are doing stuff on 20 miles per hour. I've actually taken steps which hadn't been taken previously to encourage 20 mile per hour zones and limits, to make them easier to introduce, to take away the bureaucracy, to allow local authorities to do it much more simply, put randals down in the ground, for example, rather than repeater signs. And also, you'll shortly have from ACPO, because I've negotiated this week, guidance going out to local authorities to get the police to enforce these 20 mile per hour limits. So we're doing a lot on that. And in terms of, lastly, alternative to travel, which I'm also responsible for, Minister for not travelling, that's been something which I think under the Olympics with TfL was a fantastic success in reducing the number of people travelling. And we're doing more on that. We're doing more on video technology. And there's a Greening Government Committee, Cabinet Committee, which I co-chair with Oliver Letwin, which is actually driving down the amount of travel that we in government ourselves do, including particularly flights.
Okay, great. Right, we've got plenty of time for questions. Please ask that you identify who you're from and keep the questions short because we want to try and get through as many as possible. Right, we've got I'll take two questions at a time to start off with, and there's the two there.
Jack Semple from the Road Haulage Association. Can I just pick up Norman Baker's last point? I was greatly encouraged when I heard that Al Andrews was going off to Brussels to sort out this problem. The fact is, we have the target in the directive from Brussels, and it was Brussels who set the roadmap for achieving that. Now we've heard that it's not just vehicles, never mind tailpipe emissions, but Brussels set the target, and Brussels set the way of getting it. And I haven't heard a single word today about Brussels' responsibility for contributing towards a solution.
Okay, hold that thought, and then the person just in front of you there.
Hi, Daniel Moon from Capital Simons. I just wanted to ask, with sort of the in-out referendum on the EU coming onto the agenda recently, if we do have an out vote, who will be driving air quality improvement within the UK? Because the response from DEFRA has been quite woeful, and I think we do need another air quality strategy in response to this crisis.
Okay, I'm going to start with Alan on those two, as a soon-to-be Brussels expert.
Yeah, I mean, just starting with the role of Brussels in sorting out this problem, absolutely, I couldn't agree more. One of the big problems with the current system is that the emissions regulation doesn't match up with the ambient air quality legislation. What they're doing now is trying to resolve that problem. What we're working towards with the National Emissions Ceiling Directive, sorry for the jargon, that's going to try and drive national emissions policies in such a way as they actually achieve ambient air quality limits. It's going to need some really ambitious legislation, but that's, no matter what the Commission comes out with, no matter how ambitious it is, member states, especially the UK, need to back it. And what we're seeing is that the UK, along with a lot of other member states, are being very obstructive when it comes to ambitious new legislation. They want flexibility, they don't want ambitious new commitments.
If I may come back...
No, hold on. Sorry, we've got to get through a lot of questions, but Norman, do you want to come on there?
Well, I don't think we're being very obstructive. I don't think member states aren't being very obstructive. I think what they're doing is trying to get legislation that works and is achievable. And sometimes hard and fast legislation without flexibility is bad legislation. And some of the legislation set in the past by the EU with the best of intentions hasn't actually worked. I'm wrestling in part of my other duties with the conflict which there is between the Fuel Quality Directive and the Renewable Energy Directive, which don't add up properly. So some of these legislations from Brussels doesn't work. But I would pick up the point last year about what happens with the in-out referendum. It's absolutely essential we have a European standard and European solutions on these matters, absolutely essential. And the European agenda has been one of the great successes, in my view, of the European Union over the last 20, 30 years. So the question is, what happens when the chips are down? My answer is, let's keep the chips up. And anyone who thinks that it's beneficial to the UK to leave Europe is mad.
Okay, we'll take a couple more. The gentleman in the very colourful tie, and then the chap behind it.
I think the problem of national...
Can you identify yourself, please, sir?
Can you hear me okay?
No, can you identify where you're from?
My name's Peter Diamond from Camphil.
Thank you.
I would just like to say that the problem of indoor air quality is something which should be considered, because we seem to be having very great problems in coming up with a solution to outdoor air quality at the moment. And I certainly won't be around probably in 2040 or 2050 when the solutions are said to be coming through. So couldn't we have a little bit more national government emphasis on improving indoor air quality in buildings and making people's health better protected as a result of this, because we don't seem to be coming up with very much in terms of good solutions in the short term.
Okay, and a question behind you.
Michael Lunn from the Environmental Industries Commission. I just want to pick up the issue which Norman will be aware of, is something we support with Climate Earth on the national framework for low emission zones. This is a simple kind of solution which actually could drive a lot of answers to the government's problems. And also we talk about rail. We've got high-speed rail, but actually we've got potential infrastructure in your own constituency with the Lewis-Uckfield rail link. And why don't we support creating a second rail link into London, which actually would reduce a lot of transport. So support that one for you.
Okay. Does anyone want to come in on the indoor air quality? I'm conscious that we're not exactly... Anyone on the panel? We're coming on that? Okay. What about the second point I'll ask?
Well, the low emission zones, I mean, nobody, I don't think, in government is against low emission zones, but we don't believe that necessarily they'll be the fantastic panacea that Alan seems to think they will be. I mean, if they were, and we were convinced about that, it might be a different situation, but I've just not yet seen the evidence to say they will deliver the sorts of gains which people think they will deliver. And obviously we've got the London low emission zone to look at, but you know, that's the issue for me, is actually, will it work, rather than let's just say let's go for it. The second issue, I'm very grateful for the suggestion about an alternative line to London via Lewis Hatfield. That is, of course, my constituency, so it'd be entirely improper of me to promote that within government, but I think I'll leave it to our audience to
the point that your plant is already there. Well done. Barry, go on.
Yes, on the idea of rolling out the emission zone, I mean, I do disagree with Norman here. I think let's adopt a precautionary principle. I mean, instead of saying, well, they might not work, why don't you say, these are the sort of ideas that we should be rolling out, and then giving an obligation on local authorities to report the progress that they're making. And it could be through low emission zones, it could be through and I'm delighted to hear what Norman said he was doing with the police in terms of getting enforcement going in the 20-mile-an-hour zones. There's all sorts of measures. But unless you actually put an obligation on those local authorities to be thinking constructively about the problem, you're not going to get it solved. So centrally saying, well, it might not work, really just isn't going to be good enough.
Alan, do you want to come back on any of those?
Yeah, I mean, first, I'm not suggesting for a minute that low emission zones are in any way a panacea. They're a flexible policy framework that once you've got in place, you can adapt, you can learn from experiences and adapt as the situation progresses. Backed with all the other policies that we need around modal shift, looking at fiscal incentives to make sure we don't have false incentives for diesel and for other polluting activities. But I think once we have that policy in place, then we can learn from it and move forward.
Matthew, do you want to comment on London's experience on low emission zone plans?
Well, I think that we have shown we have the largest one of its size in the world, and has brought in emissions limits for most vehicles except for private cars and motorcycles. And it has really delivered, especially on PM10, some real savings. And if other local authorities are keen on doing such similar schemes, then I can't believe that Transport for London wouldn't be more than willing to help and give guidance, because we've done it ourselves. We know the pitfalls and how to deliver it in a more efficient way than perhaps we do.
If I could just add, if you look at Germany, it has over 50 low emission zones. We have one, really, in London. We've got a few others in places like that.
And Germany is still subject to enforcement from the EU on the same basis as the UK.
Absolutely, but Germany has a much more difficult task on its hands because it's right next to Poland, Czech Republic, who are still reliant on coal for domestic heating. Their challenge is much greater than ours, and they've made significant impact on NO2, PM10, black carbon through low emission zones. They work.
Great, we'll take some more questions. The chap in the row there in the green shirt, and then the woman sitting just behind him.
Hi, Jonathan Steele from Deliver Change. We're a not-for-profit that's focused on reducing pollution in the UK. I have a simple question for each panellist. A major project that we announced last December and will be publicly announced in September is the creation of an air quality measurement network across the whole of the UK, which is all private sector funded. We'll be announcing the first step of that project across London. We already have well over 500 sensors funded. You talked about if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. So my simple question is, will we have your support for each of you?
Okay. And Iman, just behind.
Iman Martin from Bosch. I think solving the problem will not be done only from legislation, but also adapting innovative technology. And Matthew mentioned that the mayor is actually supporting electric vehicles. So what about the countermeasures for pushing this technology going forward, like change charging points, etc.? If there's any strategy due to that?
So is that strategy on charging points for electric vehicles?
Infrastructure for the electric vehicles.
Okay, Matthew, I'll come to you on first.
Well, yes, there's a Source London network which, along with Transport for London, with a series of of private sector and public sector partners have delivered 1,300 charge points across London. And I'm sure in due course more will come forward. But I think that, and there is going to be an electric vehicle strategy which the Mayor will be publishing along with our air quality, the air quality action plan, and also the our proposals when we go to consultation on the ultra-low emission zone. And they are all sort of part and parcel of the same thing. I think that the Mayor is very keen on London being the electric vehicle capital of Europe, and it's certainly true that we have far more electric vehicles here in London by proportion than anywhere else in the UK. But I think we are frustrated, as I'm sure everybody else on the panel actually is, on the slow take-up of electric vehicles. Some of that is a cultural change to do with range anxiety and these kinds of things, but also some of the automotive companies perhaps have been a bit slow at bringing the right products to market that people actually want to use. And it is quite exciting that some of the brands that perhaps may have been more worried by some of the low carbon and air quality agenda are stepping forward now with zero electric vehicles and the rest of it. And that is quite exciting. We're beginning to see, I think, a bit of a step change. And that's very much what the ultra-low emission zone is intended to do, along with addressing air quality, is actually using the regulatory levers that we the Mayor, has to stimulate that market so that, you know, you've got when the scheme order goes through next year, you've got 6 years notice. And that gives consumers and the industry, we think, enough time to get a reasonable number of markets at a reasonable price to make it feasible for consumers and industry and everybody else to be able to comply with this and bring forward that step change. So we're doing what we can to accelerate that as much as we reasonably can.
What about Jonathan's pledge to set up a load of sensors across the country independently of government? Bearing in mind, I used to work as a journalist in China, and the single most controversial air quality sensor in the world sits on top of the US Embassy in Beijing, which has, you know, amazing effects. So do we welcome that, or are you terrified of
I would
that?
only say subject to normal due diligence that we need to do. I can't see why not, but I think we'd always have to check it.
Very good. Barry?
Yeah, look, I'd be delighted to support independent monitoring, because actually I think it was King's College London report suggested that the Department for Transport measurements were actually underreporting by almost 25%. So I would very much welcome an independent check on what's actually going on. But I wouldn't welcome it if it were taking away the obligation from local authorities to do this. And I think it's absolutely vital that we do have, and this is why this whole consultation and this idea that we take away their responsibility for monitoring is so damaging, because there does need to be a public authority that people can trust that is telling them what's going on in their own local area, in their own local streets. And the figures that Guy quoted at the beginning in his opening remarks, you know, about the number, you know, 1/3 of a million school children in London going to school in roads that have, you know, next to roads that have more than within 100 meters, wasn't it, of roads that had 10,000 vehicles on the day. You know, parents want to know what risks their children are running and what action they can take to mitigate. And they need an authority that they can trust in order to do that.
Do you want to comment on this?
Yes, I mean, first of all, the issue about the lady there with the electric charging network, I mean, that is, as I mentioned earlier on, there's been thousands of charge points put in by the public sector, funded by the government, but there's thousands more, even more, being put in by the private sector. So we are now seeing a pretty fair spread, and given that an electric car can go 90 miles probably without a charge, you know, one of the concerns people have got about cars not meeting or breaking down without a charge, those are going to be put to bed, I think, if they haven't been already. And we're addressing that issue of confidence in our updated strategy on low emission vehicles, which is due out, I think, in September, which will give a further boost to what we're trying to do as a government to take that issue forward. The take-up, I should just say, by the way, the take-up is increasing. The last quarter was the best ever by some distance. And I'm quite relaxed about the take-up. There's a whole lot of new models.
What does that mean? What does that mean? Best ever by some distance. What kind of scale are we talking about?
I can't remember the exact figures, but it's some Michael Herbert still there from DFT might give you the figures, if I can't remember.
Okay.
900 in the last quarter.
900, sorry, charges. Cars sold in the last quarter. You know, the graph for the take-up is no different from the graph for any new product like a DVD or a CD or a video recorder or anything. That's the shape of the graph, and the car sales are just there. And if you look at the hybrid sales, you know, they were pretty, people were concerned about them at the beginning. They've taken off quite well. So, you know, I would be quite relaxed about the shape of the graph as far as sales are concerned. Lastly, on the point about information, which Barry spent some time in his contribution on. Look, I mean, I don't know about the depth for a consultation. I haven't seen it, but as I understand, it's a consultation, so no decisions have been taken. My view is that the more information out there in the public, the better, because people are entitled in a democracy to have access to information and make their judgments based on that. And indeed, the government, through the Cabinet Office, has been pushing a whole lot of hitherto confidential or government-contained information out into the public domain. The DFT's been busy doing that with a whole range of data sets to inform people about, say, train punctuality and everything else. So, you know, that's the direction of travel, and I would want us as a government to make sure that information we hold like that is made available to the public.
No, that's brilliant. Can I just ask then that when this comes to Cabinet Subcommittee, the DFT brief going into that Cabinet Subcommittee against option 3 of that proposal, any proposal that is the government's option favoured proposal in a 6-week consultation, you can bet your bottom dollar that's what DEFRA are going to come forward with. Please make sure that the DFT submission to Cabinet Sub opposes it.
Well, I haven't seen the consultation or the options, so I can't speak about that. What I can say is that if there's an issue about information in the public domain, that's the point I will make, the point I've just made to you just here.
Thank you.
Okay, great. Question, we'll take 3 more. Yes, take the chap at the back, and the lady there, and I'll take both of these two, yeah.
Thanks. Marcus Gibson. I used to write for the FT, Technology and Innovation, back in the 80s. I can't find any clinician or hospital in London that can find these 29,000 extra bodies, deaths, that the KCL study claims to have happened. And in general, the environmental technologies are the flakiest side of science that's full of cowboys and odd predictions and dramatic exaggerations. But can anyone tell me where are all the bodies that is apparently being produced by these PM10s?
Okay, and very briefly all the questions, yeah.
Hi, Maria Arnold from Client Earth, and we run the Healthy Air campaign. I wondered if the panel thought it would make sense for DFT to have some more formal responsibility around air quality, because it doesn't necessarily make sense for it to be DEFRA, and I understand under the old PSAs, DFT and DEFRA did have joint responsibility.
Okay, that's great. It's definitely an important issue. And then we'll take these 2 at the front.
Martin Ott-Eminox. We're one of the companies who help to retrofit buses and other vehicles in England. And sometimes there are small issues, mostly legal issues, that could help to improve the situation. We have now the 5 million clean bus fund technology, but operators just don't want to do it, even if they get a free upgrade of their bus from Euro 3 to almost better than Euro 5, because they want to pay the urea that you need to run the buses. And there's no legislation that would force bus operators to run only on those routes that municipalities consider to be the most polluted. If these little issues would be put in.
Okay, so we've got that question, yeah, thank you.
Okay, Steve Rawson, also from Eminox. As Martin said, we supply...
It's a bit of a cheat.
It's currently upfitting in London.
Very quickly, please.
Yeah, very quickly. Okay. The solution is out there now. I applaud what TfL have done. They cut through this Euro issue that they don't work. They put their own standard in. They use their own drive cycle. And you have to demonstrate it works in London, which we've done. And we talked about here, okay, independent tests. We're working with King's College this week.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, King's
What's
College.
The question, sir? What's the question?
Right, no, are you going to build on this and roll it out? Because it works, it's available now, it's much cheaper than Euro 6, and it's slightly better than Euro 6, according to TfL's own figures, not mine.
I'm going to go across the panel very briefly, please, because we're pushing time.
Guy, the gentleman from the FT, you always have to read the footnotes, and you didn't. When you got your copy of the report last year, footnote 1, mortality impacts are challenging to conceptualize and communicate. There is no group of deaths that are, quote, are directly and solely caused by or are attributed to air pollution, because exposure to pollution acts in conjunction with other risks to cause earlier death. Rather, the figure should be considered as the difference in mortality between two scenarios, one with higher pollution and thus a higher mortality rate than the other. Deaths are postponed if air quality improves, so in a specified year, X lives could be saved, these lives will live longer. And actually the figure is 11.2 years per person. There you are. That's not in the footnote. That's me adding to it.
Right, great. Alan,
Yeah,
sorry, I'd just like to say that section of the report probably took more time to phrase right than any other, so yeah. All right, well, we can discuss it afterwards, yeah.
Statistics, sir,
Statistics.
It's junk research.
Right, well, we can get to that discussion later, yeah.
The only thing I'll say on that is that figure comes from the government's own committee of medical experts who advise them on the issue. I think the chairman might even be in the room, so we can take that with him. Any specific question you want me to
No, go. I mean, we talked about DFT, formal responsibility.
Yeah, I'll go with that one. I think my own take on this is it's a real shame that all the responsibility lies with DEFRA, who don't seem to have many of the policy levers and don't seem to have the clout that they need to actually push through some decent policies. Yes, it needs cross-departmental cooperation. It can't all be just left with DEFRA.
Matthew, on that plea there for the particular technology.
Well, it sounds to me that it was constant praise for Transport for London and the Mayor. It wasn't I think it's more Norman. What I will do, I'll take this opportunity quickly and to respond to something that Barry said about the Mayor and canaries and gas masks. Now Barry and I have got some history with this. We've had this conversation about this time last year.
Quoted me, not you.
In the select committee, Parliament select committee, and the point was that we weren't putting any gas masks on canaries, or in this case, only doing dust suppressants on the routes where the machines that measure the poor air quality were. We're actually doing a trial during the Olympic period on the busiest routes, and they were the obvious corridors, and we did supply the select committee with that map, explaining that it wasn't where these measures were, it was actually where the problem we thought was the most acute. It's worth noting actually that the dust suppressants had been successful elsewhere in the world, in Scandinavia. They did not work, it seems, on many of these trunk roads, but they were very successful at industrial sites and construction sites. So we'll continue to use these dust suppressants where there's heavy construction going on and the rest of it. It did not seem to be successful as we had hoped it was going to be on the road, so we stopped. But it was, in my view, and I think this is a reasonable view, a past political attack during the election on the Mayor, the whole canaries, and trying to do human what was it called? Human fraud, public health fraud on an industrial scale and all the rest of it. It was very much used in the election campaign last year.
We'll leave that afterwards, Barry. Obviously, there was a victor in the election as well. So yeah, and last word with Norm.
Well, canaries come under DEFRA, I think, so I'll give that one away. In terms of the question of upgrading buses, I mean, no, I think that's unfair in the bus industry. They've grabbed the Green Bus Fund very successfully, and they've been investing their own money in modernising the bus fleet. They haven't taken up the 5 million yet, mainly because the bids haven't closed, and they will close till Friday, so it'll be difficult for them to do that. I'm confident there'll be bids there, and we'll be able to help retrofitting buses when bids have come in. As I say, the closing date is this Friday. And in any case, because of accessibility regulations, which have been brought in and which we're keeping to, all buses have to be replaced for accessibility reasons, disability reasons, and by definition, the new buses that come in will be cleaner anyway, as a side product of that. So I'm very confident the bus fleet is getting there. Lastly, on the DFT and responsibilities, of course it's a matter for the Prime Minister to decide what each department does, but the DFT is terribly well run, with a good coalition, and of course we'd be able to handle any extra responsibilities very well indeed.
Well done. Good point to end on there. I just finished by asking you to say thank you to our panel for an excellent debate. Thank you to you. Well done.